Good afternoon, class and professor. My name is Nicole Mitchell. Today I will be doing a presentation on stop and frisk. Stop and frisk is a well-known act in New York City. With that being said, today we will be discussing what is stop and frisk, what is a stop, how it affects people, is there controversy over it racially. I will also be giving you statistics over the years of how the act did in numbers. What is a stop? When a police officer reasonably suspects that a person has committed or is committing or about to commit a felony or a penal law misdemeanor, the officer is authorized by NYS Criminal Procedures Law 140-50 to stop, question, and possibly frisk that person for a weapon. The police officer stopped you because the officer had information requiring further investigation. The following factors contributed to the officer's suspicion, and there are multiple reasons why they can stop and frisk you if they think you are suspicious. The stop and frisk policy was adopted from English law in a number of American courts. In accordance with English common law, without statutory provision, a police officer has the power to stop, question, and frisk suspects given reasonable circumstances. Based on a standard that holds less than probable cause, the power is granted upon the standard of reasonable suspicion. It is a question of circumstances of each individual case that determines whether reasonable detention and investigation is validated. Stop and frisk was made into an area of concern by the Supreme Court when it encountered the case of Terry versus Ohio. While frisks were arguably illegal, until then, a police officer could search only someone who had been arrested, unless a search warrant had to be obtained. In the cases of Terry versus Ohio, Sabran versus New York, and Peters versus New York, the Supreme Court granted limited approval in 1968 to frisk conducted by officers lacking probable cause for an arrest in order to search for weapons if the officer believes the subject to be dangerous. The court's decision made suspicion of danger to an officer grounds for reasonable search. Judge Shahara Schindler of Federal District Court in New York upheld the bedrock principle of individual liberty on Monday when she ruled that the tactics underlying New York City's stop and frisk program violated the constitutional rights of minority citizens. She found that the city has been deliberately indifferent to police officers illegally detaining and frisking minority residents on the streets over many years. Judge Schindler was clearly speechless of Mayor Michael Bloomberg's views of turning a blind eye to the evidence officers are conducting stops in a racially discriminatory manner. In their zeal to defend a policy that have believed to be effective, they will have willfully ignored overwhelming proof that the policy of singling out the right people is racially discriminatory and therefore violates the United States Constitution. Paul J. Brown, an NYPD spokesman, defends the practice, which he says and believes saves lives, especially in communities disproportionately affected by crime, and especially among men of color who last year represented 90% of murder victims and 96% of shootings victims in New York City. Then Mayor Bloomberg defended the aspect of stopping young Black and Hispanic men at rates that do not reflect the city's overall census numbers. That the proportion of stops generally reflects of crime numbers that does not mean, as the judge wrongfully concluded, that the police are engaging in racial profiling. It means that they are stopping people in those communities who fit descriptions of suspects or are engaged in suspicious activity. The The statistics reinforce that the crime numbers have shown for decades that blacks in the city were disproportionately the victims of violent crimes, followed by Hispanics. Their assailants were disproportionately black and Hispanic too. Another view on NYPD. They are using the stop and frisk policy as an excuse to put their racial agenda ahead of public safety. Out of the 2.3 million blacks stopped between 2004 and 2012, the Center for Constitutional Rights reported that 16,000 were seized, at rate of 143 stops per seizure. The stopping of Hispanics led to 99 stops per seizure, while every 27 of the Caucasian led to the seizure of an illicit good. The rate at which white people were found with something illegal was roughly 5 times more than the searching of blacks. By unfairly targeting minorities, officers are pulling their attention away from suspects who actually have foul intentions. The Stop and Frisk program has come into attack by the Community Safety Act, a bill with the intent to increase the oversight of NYPD and the end of racial profiling. Every time a police officer stops a person in New York City, the police officer is supposed to fill out a form recording the details of the stop. The forms were filled out by hand and manually entered into the NYPD database until 2017, which is this year. When the forms became electronic, there are 2 ways the NYPD reports this stop and frisk data: a paper report released quarterly and an electronic database released annually. The paper reports, which the NYCL releases every 3 months, includes data on the stops, arrests, and summonses. The data are broken down by precinct of the stop and the race and gender of the person stopped. The paper reports provide a basic snapshot on stop and frisk activity by precinct and are available here. The electronic database includes nearly all of the data recorded by the police officer after a stop. The data include the person, age that was stopped, if a person was frisked, if there was a weapon or firearm recovered, if physical force was used, and the exact location of a stop within the precinct. Having the electronic database allows researchers to look in greater detail at what happens during the stop. Below are CSV files containing data from the 2012 electronic database. A record 680